Hello everyone, I'm making another top 10 video because the previous one was actually quite fun to make. So the previous top 10 video, which I would consider to be the best video I've ever made, is top 10 worst bosses of all time. Now, I'm going to do top 10 hardest bosses of all time. Now, before we begin, I would just like to set some ground rules. So I'm not going to include any impossible boss fights or boss fights where you're meant to lose but can win. The reason for this is the game developers don't intend for you to actually beat the boss, so it's just not fair to count them. I'm also going to be limiting the amount of retro bosses in this list. The reason for this is the arcade games are designed to be really hard, so you pay more money to try again, and the NES games are designed to be really hard because they didn't have much cartridge space, so to increase the playtime, they just made the games really hard. It's effectively artificial difficulty, and it's kind of cheating, so I'm not going to include that. And finally, no player controlled bosses. The Wraith from Evolve would easily get the #1 spot on this list, but I'm not going to include him just because a player controls him. Anyway, without any further ado, let's just get right into it. Starting us off at number 10 is Grim Matchstick from Cuphead. Yep, you know this list is going to be interesting when Cuphead is number 10. Ah yes, Grim Matchstick, the boss you fight in the sky. Now, there's quite a few other bosses from Cuphead which could have made this spot, but I decided to go with Grim Matchstick purely just because everyone is saying he's the hardest one, and I was like, alright then. Shout out to Dr. Cal's robot. Now, this is a relatively short boss fight, one of the shorter ones on the list, only clocking in at 2.5 minutes, but those 2 minutes probably feel way longer when you're playing the game. There's a reason for that. This boss has such a low margin of error that it's actually insane. Just a single mistake can make you get hit multiple times and probably even kill you. The first thing you'll notice about why this boss is hard are the platforms that you stand on. The clouds sometimes have a habit of blending into the background, so sometimes you just miss them entirely. Bearing in mind you also need to position yourself on the correct platform so you can avoid the boss's attacks, and this isn't even factoring in the fact that you also need to attack him as well. The first phase looks simple enough. He shoots a couple fireballs, you can move out the way, looks simple enough. But then he moves behind you and starts spamming more attacks. Bearing in mind you also need to shoot him while he's behind you and you're running in the opposite direction. After you do enough damage to him in this phase, he goes to phase 3. This is where the fight gets really hard as he sprouts 2 more heads. He also stays behind you and the sky goes dark, so it's harder to see the platforms. And in this phase, he starts spamming attacks like crazy. He shoots multiple fireballs where, when broken, they split into more fireballs. He has an attack which can completely block out an entire section of the platforms, which is especially bad if he does it in the middle. And now he takes up like 1/3 of the screen, which means you now are limited on the amount of platforms you can jump onto. Bearing in mind all of these attacks need to be dodged on platforms which are already hard to see while shooting in the opposite direction of where you're moving. I mean, he seems like an awesome boss, but I wouldn't want to fight him. Up next is a fringe contender from my first boss list, Bladebearer and Cannoneer from Code Vein. If you remember correctly, these guys were in the honorable mentions and were just about to take the number 10 spot, until I found out Deus Ex Human Revolution. I didn't really get to talk about why this boss was bad or hard, but I'll do that now. So, Bladebearer and Cannoneer is a really long boss fight. The video I found of it is 13 minutes long. Jesus Christ. For comparison, the hardest boss in Dark Souls 3, Dark Eater Medea, only took 5 minutes, less than half the time of this boss, and that fight is one of the longer ones in the game. Now, this fight is probably the worst gank fight ever made ever. This fight is pretty similar to Ornstein and Smaug. There's a quick guy who's really aggressive and a fat guy who wants nothing to do with you. The reason it falls flat on its face here is because the fat guy doesn't move at all. The fat guy doesn't block the speedy guy. Also, the fat guy has ranged attacks. So not only do you have the speedy guy to deal with, you also have ranged attacks to deal with, which basically means you need to be looking at the fat guy the entire time while the speedy guy is attacking you from close range. These ranged attacks aren't easy to dodge either. He has a move that goes straight underneath you, and these moves do a ton of damage. They can potentially 2-shot you in a fight where getting hit is so easy. Now, Code Vein does offer you an AI companion to take some of the hits, but the thing is, they die in like 5 seconds, so there's kind of no point in bringing them. The second issue with this boss fight is how much health both of them have. The reason Ornstein and Smaug were good was because by themselves they weren't that difficult of a boss. You could take down their health fairly quickly actually. But not Bladebearer and Cannoneer. Bladebearer by herself is a pretty difficult boss just because she has so much health and does so much damage. Combine that with a fat guy that does pretty much the exact same thing and doesn't block them in the slightest, then you have a recipe for disaster. And you also have one of the hardest bosses of all time. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, Bladebearer also has ranged attacks and AoE attacks. Why? This makes going for just Cannoneer basically impossible because Bladebearer is so fast and can hit you from pretty much anywhere. And in a battle as long as it is, having a margin of error this small just isn't fair. This next boss I've actually fought and beaten, and let me just say, it was the hardest boss fight I've ever done. This boss is Senator Armstrong from Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Now, this boss is hard. Well done. Well done. Lovely. Lovely. Well done. Well done.
No shit, Sherlock!
First off, this is the longest single player boss fight out of any on the list, clocking in at 40 minutes. In fairness though, about 30 of those 40 minutes are cutscenes, but even then, that's 10 minutes of this really hard boss. This guy does some of the highest damage on the entire list, being able to one-shot you with multiple moves. He can't be parried, you can only block him. He has many unblockable attacks that he loves to spam. He has these blade mode sections where you need to put in a correct input at the right time, but that input you're not given enough time to put in. Despite being such a long fight, there's no checkpoints, there's healing points, but there's no checkpoints. He has a move that can heal him back to full health, and also it parries every single one of your moves. He has very offbeat timings, meaning blocking him is actually way harder than it sounds. He has one of the largest health bars on the entire list, clocking in at a whopping 200% health. Every time you hit him, you do 1%, if that. He can't be stunned unless you're attacking him way more than you should. He has a very deceptively large range, despite only using his hands. Pretty much all of his moves cover the entire stage. Also, he has 3 moves with the exact same wind-up, so you pretty much need to guess which one he's going to use. And this is normal difficulty. It's not even hard mode. On hard mode, I think this guy easily makes the top 5. I mean, there's a pretty solid argument to be made there. The only reason he doesn't make it into the top 5 is purely just because there's an easy mode. Normal mode is enough to get him onto the list, but there's an easy mode. Don't get me wrong, he's no slouch even on easy mode, but the fact that there is an easy mode means he goes down a couple spots. I mean, at least his soundtrack's cool. It's one of the best boss themes I've heard in a while. I'm still surprised I actually beat him. I can't believe I actually did it, but I did. I don't know how, but I did. The next boss is Sigrun, Queen of the Valkyries from God of War 2018. Now this boss is infamous among the God of War fandom for being really hard. It may look pretty easy in the video, and that's because the guy playing it is a beast. He's playing it on the hardest difficulty and isn't even taking any damage. But even then, you can see how little damage he's doing to this boss and how many attacks he needs to avoid and block and parry and all that kind of stuff. You can see that, right? This boss is basically if Senator Armstrong had the same attack rate as Grim Matchstick. Insanely high health. Insanely high damaging attacks. A really long runtime, which makes this an endurance fight even when the margin of error is already so low. She has a huge arsenal of attacks because she's pretty much 4 bosses in one. All of her attacks you pretty much need to instinctively be able to react to because they do insane damage. Somehow, with all of this stuff that she's got going for her, she's somehow still fair, which, that's actually quite a good achievement, well done. I give her the slight edge over Senator Armstrong purely just because there's more difficulties in God of War than there is in Metal Gear Rising, which means you can crank the difficulty notch way higher than you can on Senator Armstrong. What else is there to say? She's just a harder, fairer version of Armstrong. Number 6, the Orphan of Kos, probably the most disgusting boss on the entire list. He is regarded as the hardest boss in FromSoft history, and I'm not disagreeing. Bloodborne itself is a really hard game, but this guy stands right at the top as the pinnacle of difficulty. Now this dude is a being called Kos's unborn fetus. He's less than a newborn baby. Imagine how strong Kos would have been. Now this fight has 2 stages and is actually one of the more fair fights on the list. The first stage is, it's not that hard compared to some of the stuff we've seen already. If the entire fight was just the first phase, it wouldn't even make the list, not even close. But that second phase, oh my god, the second phase. Phase 1 doesn't really have anything troublesome. Like, he'd still be one of the harder bosses in the franchise, he just wouldn't be the hardest. His attacks are fairly easy to dodge, actually. But in the second phase, he completely throws that all out the window, screams at the top of his lungs, and just starts charging. He has an insanely large health bar that most weapons would barely be able to whittle down. He does some of the highest damage in the entire Dark Souls franchise, and that means something. He has range that will make Senator Armstrong blush. He attacks at pretty much the same rate Grim Matchstick does. Healing can feel like an impossible gamble considering how fast this dude attacks and whether or not you'll actually survive the next attack. The thing that makes this guy stand out over the other two boss fights that are hard for pretty much the same reason is the counter system in Bloodborne. Now, the way the counter system in Bloodborne works is, if you're in the middle of an attack and they hit you in the middle of that attack, they do double damage. Do you see where I'm coming from? If this happens to you, you are dead instantly. There's no surviving that. You are dead. Bearing in mind, you also don't get immunity frames while you're dodging in Bloodborne, which basically means this guy is almost impossible to dodge. He's pretty much unstunnable. There is a way to stun him, but you need to land a power attack on the back of him. And considering how fast this guy hits, I wouldn't ever try to power attack him ever. That's just a terrible idea. Oh yeah, that massive thing he's whacking you with? Yeah, that's not a massive shrimp. That's actually his placenta. Ugh. Now, I actually was considering another FromSoft boss for this spot. I was considering the Demon of Hatred. Now, the reason the Demon of Hatred is so hard is because he's a Sekiro boss that plays like a Dark Souls boss. Sekiro was basically spent the entire game up until this point to teach you not to play like Dark Souls. But this boss plays like Dark Souls. You can parry him, but it's way easier to just dodge. The only reason I put the Orphan of Kos above him is because of the counter system, and also because the Orphan sticks to old mechanics and is still insanely hard. With all of this being said, he's still one of the fairer bosses on the list, and also he's one of the better ones as well. Up next is Hayabusa from Neo. This guy is like a Dark Souls boss on steroids. This battle is more like Grim Matchstick, where it's not really that long, so it's not much of an endurance fight. It's just very, very easy to die. Now, I was going to include this guy in the honorable mentions of the previous list, but I chose not to for some reason. This boss doesn't have that much health, and he doesn't even have that many moves. He just has the highest damage of any boss on the entire list. You heard me right, the single highest damage of any boss. And look how fast this guy's attacking. How is that even fair? You would think that this boss wouldn't be able to one-shot you considering he's so fast, but no, he can easily one-shot you with multiple moves. If he lands a single hit on you, it could mean certain death, and with how fast this guy attacks, it makes the Orphan of Kos look like a pussy. The guy in the video did an amazing job of avoiding damage. He only got hit once the entire video, but the one time he did get hit, oh my god. Like, you saw how fast that attack was as well. Why does it do that much damage? Why? This guy, when you kill him, actually drops some of the best stuff in the game, but if he doesn't drop it, you need to fight him again. You basically need to grind this boss in order to get some of the best stuff in the game. I mean, it makes sense that he drops it, but why do you need to grind him? The reason why he's a fringe contender for my previous list was purely just because, why is it fair that a boss that moves that quick can do that much damage? Why is that fair? How did it not make my previous list? Up next is another familiar face, Absolute Radiance from Hollow Knight. And unlike Bladebearer and Cannoneer, where they were only mentioned in the honorable mentions, this boss actually made it pretty high on the list. The reason he made it so high on the list was because it's the endurance battle to end all endurance battles. The boss fight himself is only 4 minutes long, so you're thinking, well, how was it that much of an endurance battle? Well, first off, Hollow Knight's a really fast-paced game. Those 4 minutes feel like hours. Also, this boss comes at the end of a thing called the 5th Pantheon. Now, I explained it in my previous video, but if you haven't seen it, I'll just explain it now. The Pantheon of Hollow Nest is a boss rush of every single boss in the entire game of Hollow Knight. There's a lot of bosses in Hollow Knight, 49 to be exact. That's more than Dark Souls 1 and 3 combined. And guess what? There's no checkpoints. There's healing stations, but there's no checkpoints. The final 3 bosses in the Pantheon of Hollow Nest are the 3 hardest bosses in the entire game. So basically, if you complete the entire Pantheon of Hollow Nest and then die to any of the 3, then you need to restart the entire thing again because there's no checkpoints. This could take up to 40 minutes just to have a single rematch. And keep in mind, you might not even be able to beat all 46 bosses every time consistently. instantly. Now, Absolute Radiance is the boss right at the very end of that. That's enough to put it on the list alone, but wait, there's more. All 3 of the final boss fights do double damage, so you're effectively on half health the entire time. And the healing station is at the beginning of the 3 boss fights. Not in the middle, at the beginning. So if you get beaten to the brink of death by either of the first 2, when you do the next fight, you're pretty much already lost. And the cherry on the top, Absolute Radiance, by himself, is enough to make the list. He is insanely hard. He's like Grim Matchstick on steroids. Now with the 40-minute long run back, the 2 really hard bosses right before him, and also the fact that by himself he's able to make the list quite comfortably, it's a very easy pick. And I'd be stupid not to include him. And just think, there's 3 bosses that ranked above him. How? Now, at the beginning of the video, I said I made a rule to keep as little NES games on this list as possible. I explained the reason why earlier, but this guy is going to be the only exception to the list, and I'm pretty sure you all know why. This boss is Mike Tyson from Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Now, there's a reason Floyd Mayweather ends up this high on the list. Now, there's a theme of this list. Muhammad Ali is no exception. Insanely high health, insanely high damage, really quick attacks. The thing that makes Anthony Joshua stand out over all of the others is the fact that he has some of the hardest attacks to dodge in video game history. Every attack Tyson Fury does has little to no wind up at all, and the speed at which he dishes them out means you're gonna die very, very quickly. And because his wind-ups are so short, you need to be paying attention to every single tiny little move he does, and that's another thing that makes this guy hard. He does dummy punches. Now, if you dodge one of George Foreman's dummy punches, you're almost certainly going to get hit by his next punch that he will definitely do. Every single punch you need to examine really, really carefully to make sure it's a dummy or not, and punching back can feel like an impossible gamble. Keep in mind the fact that this boss has insanely high health already, and it's a pretty hard boss. Now, I know what you're thinking. He can't be too different from the bosses we've already seen. Like, there was some insane stuff earlier. Well, you need to take this guy out multiple times. It's the only boss on the list where you need to do that, and in a fight that's already really hard to win, asking us to do it multiple times is basically criminal. Now, the reason I chose Jack Dempsey over all other NES bosses is purely just because this guy's the most fair. Like I said in the beginning, the arcade games just want more money, and the NES games want you to play them more, so the bosses were going to be really hard. Now, Punch-Out, being both an NES game and an arcade game, wasn't any different, but the thing is, this boss was actually fair. I mean, he was fair by NES standards anyway, and Rocky was still widely regarded as being the hardest boss anyway. Next up is a boss you've definitely never heard of, from a game you've definitely never heard of. It's Queen Laisse from Mushihi Mesama Futari, which directly translates into Bug Princess 2. Alright then. Okay, so let's get into why this boss is— oh my god. Look at this, what is this? How is anyone supposed to do this? Look at this is insane, what the hell? Why? You think it starts off hard, well look at how it ends. What the hell is this? Why? Now, from that, I don't really think I need to explain why this boss is as high as it is, because just look for yourself what the hell is going on. The only thing preventing this boss from getting the top spot is purely just the fact it doesn't do that much damage. As many projectiles as there are, it doesn't do much damage actually. But dodge those projectiles. Do it, I dare you. Dodge them. Exactly. This boss actually has quite a few phases. Now, I can't see them because of all the projectiles, but they're there. Now, I know what you're thinking. What the hell could be harder than that? Did you see that previous boss? What could get harder than that? Well, let me tell you. But first, a word from our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. I'm joking. Honorable mentions. I just went over what I recorded about Queen Laisse, and I hereby retract the statement about her not doing much damage. See those 6 green little circle things on the bottom left of the screen? Yeah, those are your hit points. One bullet from her takes out one of those. Basically, you can only withstand 6 hits from her, and looking at how fast she shoots— okay, good luck dodging all of those, my friend. In fairness, by this list standards, 6 hits to die is actually a fair amount. Our first honourable mention is going to be Dark Eater Midir from Dark Souls 3. Now, I mentioned how hard this guy was in my Dark Souls 3 boss ranking video, and I also mentioned him in this video. Thing is, he just got completely outdone by Senator Armstrong, so I couldn't really include him. Sinistar and Jason from Friday the 13th. I didn't want to include these guys because they're both retro games, but I thought it was necessary to mention them anyway, just because if I didn't have that rule, they would both be in the list quite high. Bernard from Fury. I was really considering adding this guy to the list, and on second thought, I probably should have done, but I think he just got completely outdone by Queen Lasse because she's kind of cornered the bullet hell market. So, yeah, it's a shame. This boss does look really hard and he actually looks quite fun, but, you know, you can't win everything. Psycho Mantis from Metal Gear 3. This boss would be on the list if you couldn't just plug your controller into the second slot and make him a total wash. And finally, the last honorable mention is Ishin the Sword Saint from Sekiro. This guy is widely regarded as one of the hardest bosses of all time, and the reason he didn't appear on the list was because I wanted Sekiro's representation to be the Demon of Hatred. Ishin isn't an easy boss, but compared to the Orphan of Kos and the Demon of Hatred, he just isn't that hard. But anyway, it's the moment you've all been waiting for, and let's get into the number 1 spot. Now, I'm not sure if I'm cheating with this boss because it's a raid boss, but it's pre-patch Absolute Virtue from Final Fantasy XI. I was considering putting Khotun from World of Warcraft in this spot, but looking at the state of him now, people can solo him. You can't do that for Absolute Virtue. The video of people actually killing Absolute Virtue now is after the patch, and they still need to apply 2 minutes of buffs. 2 entire minutes. Bearing in mind, this is tons of people going at it and they were still barely able to do it. And this is after the patch. So what made Absolute Virtue so hard? Well, before the patch, Absolute Virtue had 100,000 health, which in that game is a lot. He also regenerated 500 health per tick. Per tick is every 3 seconds. For comparison, the player heals 1 health per tick. So pretty much every attack you do, he can almost immediately heal off, which is just insane. There was a way to kill him, but according to the devs, it wasn't legitimate, because every single time someone beat him in a special way, they patched it out. So at the peak of Absolute Virtue's difficulty, a massive guild went together and fought him for 30 hours straight. That's when they encountered the most unfair move of any boss of all time ever. Just before you kill Absolute Virtue, he has a move which can immediately restore half of his health. He can use it multiple times in a row. So basically, everything they did in those 30 hours meant nothing. I feel like I did an alright job explaining it, but if you want a little bit more detail, just read this. Now this boss actually had a level cap. The cap was level 75. You could go beyond level 75 though. So if you were a higher level than level 75, you weren't allowed to fight the boss. This basically meant that the people doing more than 500 damage every 3 seconds weren't allowed to fight the boss. The devs released a video of how to beat this boss, and still no one could do it because this boss was just that hard and the video was way too vague. So in the end, the devs eventually nerfed the boss. I mean, they had to. They reduced his max health from 100,000 to 66,000, and they also increased the level cap. So now level 99 players can fight him, which is really good. That makes killing him way easier. They didn't do this because the boss was too hard. They did this because they were getting complaints about people spending hours of their life fighting him just for him to basically fully restore his health. So they added a time limit, and with the video I found, the time limit really isn't necessary because they killed it in about 6 minutes. Now, I was considering Khotun from World of Warcraft for this bit, but the reason I didn't put Khotun here was because people can solo him now. You can't solo Absolute Virtue, he's still too hard, which is basically the essence of a raid boss, and also he's harder than Khotun. Another reason I put Absolute Virtue above Khotun was purely just because the devs told people how to beat him and people still couldn't do it because he was that busted. Now, I made myself a rule to try and not include all the really unfair boss fights, and I know this is really unfair, like about as unfair as they come, but I couldn't help but not include it in the top spot because how do you get harder than this? I mean, this boss took a massive group of people 30 hours to kill it, and they still couldn't do it because it has that one move which regenerates half of its health. When a massive group of people all go at the boss at the same time for 30 hours straight and lose, that is when the boss is #1 hardest of all time. I don't even care if it's unfair. How do you beat that? Now, I'm not sure if you'll agree with me on my picks, because I mean, literally the number 1 spot was a boss you can't even fight anymore because he got patched. But if you do disagree with me about something, like you thought there's a boss that should have been on the list but wasn't, or a boss that shouldn't be on the list which was, just let me know down in the comments and I might make a revised version in the future. I don't know. If you want to see that, just let me know. I'll pretty much make anything if someone requests me to do it. Like, why not? Well, look, it's my favorite part of the video to do, the outro. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching the video. If you stayed all the way to the end, make sure to drop a like and subscribe. I really wanted to do another top 10 video just because I remember really enjoying making the previous one. I'm gonna try and make my upload rate a little bit better because at the moment I'm uploading a video every 2-3 months, so that's not a very good way to build your channel. And I thought my last video that I did was not very good. I wasn't very proud of the Layers of Fear video. I'll try and continue that series, but I just wasn't too fond of that one video in particular. Well, that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed the video, and get prepared for some of the stuff I'm gonna do next, because I like making stuff.